A poor homeless girl was scavenging through alleys for food when she heard terrifying screams that froze her blood. She peeked around the corner and saw the unthinkable. The millionaire's son was being violently dragged by two masked men into a black van. Without a second thought, she grabbed a wooden stick from the trash and dashed into the dark alley after the kidnappers. With her heart pounding out of her chest, she screamed, "Let him go now!" The men slowly turned around, and she realized she had done something dangerous. What happens next is shocking. The autumn sun cast a golden, melancholic light over Central Park, painting the fallen leaves in shades of copper and amber. For Richard, the park was both a refuge and a prison. His Italian leather shoes, polished to a mirror shine, trod with a silent dissonance on the gravel path, a costly sound in a place where poverty whispered from every chipped bench and in every tired laugh. At 35, he had built an empire from nothing, a colossus of tech and innovation that had earned him a fortune he could barely count. Yet, the weight in his chest was a liability no balance sheet could calculate. Every day, at the same time, he left the glass and steel tower that bore his name and walked these paths, not in search of leisure, but of a ghost. The ghost of a smile he had lost nearly 2 decades ago, a smile that haunted his dreams and made every achievement feel a little more hollow. It was on one of these afternoons, as his mind drifted from profit projections and delved into the painful memories of his adolescence, that a small, surprisingly clear voice pulled him from his trance. "Excuse me, sir." Richard looked down. Standing before him was a girl of maybe 8, with worn clothes and a face that bore a layer of grime that couldn't hide the vivid intelligence in her large brown eyes. She didn't hold out a supplicating hand, nor did she adopt the look of rehearsed pity he saw so often. She met his gaze with an out-of-place dignity, a seriousness that intrigued him instantly. "Would you have any spare change for something to eat? I haven't eaten yet today." The formality of her speech, the careful construction of the sentence, struck him more than any desperate plea. He saw in her not just hunger, but a brilliant mind trapped by circumstance. Instead of coins, Richard offered something better. "Wait here a minute," he said, his voice softer than the one he used in his boardrooms. He walked to a small deli just outside the park entrance and returned with 2 large turkey and cheese sandwiches and a bottle of orange juice. He sat on a nearby bench and held out one of the sandwiches to her. The girl accepted with a barely audible, "Thank you, sir," and began to eat with a delicacy that contrasted with her evident hunger. They sat in silence for a while. The only sounds the child's polite chewing and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Richard felt a strange calm. In that moment, he wasn't the billionaire CEO, he was just a man sharing a meal on a park bench. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Leah," she replied between bites. "And yours?" The question caught him off guard. No one in the park ever asked for his name. "Richard." "Thank you for the sandwich, Richard," she said, testing the name in her mouth as if it were a new and interesting word. "You look sad, even when your mouth is smiling." The observation hit him like a stone, direct and precise. It was something his closest partners and even his family hesitated to say. This little stranger, with breadcrumbs at the corner of her mouth, had read his soul in under 10 minutes. He forced a smile that felt false. "Sometimes life leaves you missing things, Leah." He stood, feeling the conversation had become too personal, too dangerous. "I have to go now, take care." He turned to leave, his heart heavier than before, when her voice, as firm and clear as ever, stopped him again. "I know, especially when you're trying to get Project Aurora to work." Richard froze. His feet felt rooted to the ground. He turned back slowly, the blood running cold in his veins. How could she possibly know about Project Aurora, the top-secret codename for his newest philanthropic initiative, something he had only mentioned in a single closed-door meeting the week before? A chill ran down Richard's spine. sharper than the autumn breeze seeping through his designer coat. The world seemed to fall silent, the distant laughter of other children and the hum of the city fading into a vacuum of disbelief. He crouched, bringing himself to the girl's eye level, trying to decipher the mystery held in those brown irises. "Leah, how do you know that name? Who told you about Project Aurora?" His tone, usually calm and commanding, was now a tense whisper, a mixture of fear and fascination. Leah didn't flinch. She just shrugged with a disarming naturalness, as if the question were the most ordinary thing in the world. "I heard some men in suits talking here in the park the other day. They were talking loud. One of them seemed mad at you." The explanation was so simple, so plausible, that for a moment it relieved him, but only for a moment. The seed of doubt had been planted. He knew how airtight that operation was. The chance of his executives discussing it aloud in a public park was practically zero. Despite the strangeness, something kept him from walking away. There was a magnetic pull to this child, a vulnerability wrapped in a precocious wisdom that drew him in irresistibly. From that day on, their meetings became a sacred ritual in his schedule. He would arrive punctually at 5 p.m., always with a different snack and a story to tell. In return, Leah offered him fragments of her own life, small pearls of observation about the world as seen from below. She spoke of the ants that worked as a team, the birds that always knew when rain was coming, and the stars that, she said, were the eyes of angels watching over lost children. Before long, Mr. Richard gave way to a fond Uncle Richard, a title that echoed in a hollow place in his heart, filling it with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He found himself looking forward to these meetings, the high point of his days filled with sterile meetings and calculated decisions. One afternoon, as they shared a bag of animal crackers, Leah mentioned casually, "And my special friend brought me a warm coat yesterday. She said it's going to get much colder." Richard's heart tightened with a mix of relief and jealousy. He was glad she had someone else looking out for her, but a selfish part of him wanted to be her sole protector. "That's great, Leah. And who is this special friend of yours?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Leah's eyes twinkled with secrecy. "Oh, she's special. She doesn't like to be seen." "Says it's better that way." Her evasiveness only sharpened his curiosity. Was it a social worker, another person helping her out? The idea of a mysterious figure in Leah's life unsettled him. He needed to know she was safe. He tried not to push, changing the subject to a book of fairy tales he had brought her, but the seed of doubt, planted at their first meeting, began to sprout more vigorously. Leah's intelligence, her knowledge of things she shouldn't know, was now compounded by the existence of this secret friend. He felt he was on the edge of a puzzle, far larger than the simple story of a street girl. As he read to her about princesses and castles, his mind wandered, trying to connect the dots that made no sense. He was getting too attached. He knew that. He was opening a door to pain, the same door he had bolted shut since his first love, Helena, had vanished from his life like smoke. Leah yawned, leaning her head against his arm for a moment, a gesture of pure trust that disarmed all his defenses. In that instant, he promised himself he would protect her, no matter the cost. As he was saying goodbye, Leah held his hand. "Uncle Richard," she said, her eyes locked on his, "why don't you like blackberry pie anymore? It used to be your favorite, right? The kind Helena's grandmother used to make." Richard's world stopped turning. The air thinned in his lungs, and for a moment, the sounds of the park became a high-pitched whine in his ears. Blackberry pie, Helena's grandmother. That was a detail so intimate, so deeply buried in the layers of his memory, that he rarely allowed himself to revisit it. It was a secret locked away in a dusty vault in his soul, a secret that belonged only to him and to her. The way the sugar caramelized at the edges, the scent that filled the small country kitchen, Helena's smile as she stole a piece before it was time, and now This sacred memory was on the lips of a child he barely knew, spoken with the same casualness as a comment on the weather. He gripped her by the shoulders, harder than he intended, his eyes searching her face for an answer. "Leah, who told you that? This is very important. You have to tell me who told you that story." The girl blinked, surprised by his intensity, but not frightened. There was a calm in her that disarmed him. "My special friend. She tells me stories to help me sleep. Sometimes the stories are about a sad man who lost the girl he loved." The answer, so simple and yet so complex, did not quell the storm inside him. On the contrary, it only intensified it. A special friend who told stories about his life. These were no longer coincidences. This was deliberate. Someone was using Leah, this innocent child, to reach him, to poke at his oldest wounds. Why? Was this a cruel game, an attempt at extortion? His business-trained mind, adept at identifying risks and patterns, raced in every direction, but none made sense. The detail about the pie was too personal to be public knowledge. Only Helena would know. The possibility, as absurd as it seemed, hit him. Was Helena nearby? And if so, why would she communicate through a child instead of approaching him directly? He let go of her, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of pure frustration. "Leah, this friend of yours, do you know where she lives? What's her name?" Leah shook her head. "She won't tell me. She says it's a secret, for her safety. But she's good, Uncle Richard. She takes care of me." The loyalty in the girl's voice was unshakable. Richard realized he wouldn't get anything more from her today. He was looking at a piece of a puzzle, while the person holding the complete picture hid in the shadows. The simple joy these meetings had brought him was now tainted by a dark and painful mystery. Now, every innocent question from Leah, every sharp observation, seemed loaded with hidden meaning. He felt watched, analyzed by a ghost from his past. That meeting ended differently. The familiar warmth was replaced by a palpable tension. Richard said his goodbyes with his mind racing. As he got into his car, the silence of the leather interior seemed to amplify the chaos in his thoughts. He picked up his phone and called Mark, his head of security and only confidant. "Mark, I need a favor, a discreet one. I want you to look into every social worker, volunteer, anyone who works with street kids in the Central Park area. I'm looking for a woman. I don't have a name, no description, just look for anything out of the ordinary." He knew it was a shot in the dark, an almost impossible task, but he had to do something. He could no longer be a passive participant in this strange game. He needed to understand who was moving the pieces. As he drove away from the park, the image of Leah's face was burned into his mind. He was becoming dangerously attached to this girl, and now she was the key to unlocking the pain that had defined him for so long. He felt himself being pulled back into a past he had fought so hard to forget. And the idea both terrified him and ignited a forbidden spark of hope in his heart. Stopping at a red light, he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man staring back looked older, more tired. And then he remembered another question Leah had asked just before he left, a question that haunted him even more than the one about the pie. She had said in a whisper, almost as a stray thought, "Uncle Richard, did you ever wonder why Helena's favorite flowers were sunflowers, even though she was allergic to them?" Sunflowers. The mention of those flowers was like pouring salt into a wound. Richard vividly remembered the day he discovered Helena's allergy. They were 16, and he had picked a sunflower from a garden on his way to meet her, a gesture he thought was the height of romance. Her reaction, however, was not what he expected. Her eyes watered, her nose turned red, and she began to sneeze uncontrollably. Between sneezes, she laughed, a genuine, infectious laugh that turned the disaster into a cherished memory. "I love them from a distance," she had said, "because they always search for the light, no matter how dark it is, even if they hurt me up close." That sentence had become a metaphor for their relationship. something he only understood years later. Their closeness, so full of light, had ended up causing him immense pain. And now, that memory, so specific and bittersweet, was back, brought by the same mysterious little girl. The conclusion was inescapable. Leah's special friend wasn't just someone who knew Helena, she was Helena. The revelation left him reeling, a whirlwind of conflicting emotions warring inside him. Anger for being abandoned without a word, pain for the wound that never healed, and beneath it all, a treacherous undercurrent of hope. If it was her, why was she hiding? Why use a child as an intermediary? He needed answers. The investigation he'd asked Mark to run was no longer enough. He had to act, to force the hand of this ghostly figure. The third week of his meetings with Leah began with a new strategy. Richard would no longer ask direct questions. Instead, he started to leave his own bait, testing the waters, trying to provoke a reaction from the unseen observer. He talked casually about his plans to expand his company overseas, a complete lie, to see if Leah would mention anything about travel. He commented on how he was thinking of selling his parents' old house, the place where he and Helena had shared so many moments. Every conversation was a chess match, with Leah as the innocent pawn in the center of the board. The response came in a subtle but unmistakable way. One day, Leah handed him a drawing she'd made on a piece of cardboard. It was a crude portrait of him, smiling in front of a country house with a large sunflower in the yard. "My friend helped me draw it," she said. "She said you'd look happier if you went back to a place that once made you happy." The message was clear. She was listening, she was reacting, and she still cared, or at least wanted him to think she did. Richard's frustration grew with each passing day. This cat-and-mouse game was draining his energy, reopening old wounds he preferred to keep buried. He was being manipulated, and he hated it. But the desire to see her, to hear her voice, to finally understand why she had left, was stronger than his pride. At the end of that week, he made a decision: no more games. He needed a confrontation. The next day, he arrived at the park early, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found Leah sitting on their bench, swinging her small legs that didn't reach the ground. He sat beside her, the tension making his shoulders ache. "Leah," he said, his voice firm, "I need you to do something very important for me. I want you to tell your friend that I will be here tomorrow at this same time. And if she doesn't come with you, I won't be able to come see you anymore." The words came out harsher than he intended. Leah's face crumpled in panic and confusion. "Why, Uncle Richard? Did I do something wrong?" Guilt hit him squarely. He was using this child, the one person who had pierced his armor in years, as a pawn in his personal war. He softened his voice, taking her small hand in his. "No, sweetie, you didn't do anything wrong. It's just, your friend and I, we have unfinished business, and it's past time we talked." He felt like a monster for placing this burden on her, but he saw no other way. He had to drag the ghost out of the shadows and into the light, even if the light blinded him. Leah stared at him for a long moment, her wise eyes seeming to weigh the truth in his words. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I'll tell her. But she's scared, Uncle Richard. She's really scared of something." The next day dawned grey and oppressive, a perfect reflection of Richard's state of mind. He had barely slept, his mind endlessly replaying possible scenarios for the meeting. Would she show up? And if she did, what would he say? 18 years of unasked questions, of suppressed anger and silent grief, were clumping in his throat, threatening to choke him. Every minute at the office felt like an eternity. He cancelled all his meetings, unable to focus on anything but the clock's hands, crawling toward 5 p.m. The vulnerability he felt was terrifying. He, the man who controlled an empire, who made billion-dollar decisions with the coolness of a surgeon, was completely at the mercy of a memory, of a ghost that might not even materialize. When he finally reached the park, His heart was beating a frantic symphony. The air was damp, hinting at rain. He saw Leah from a distance, standing near the old, rusted carousel, a small spot of color in the day's somber palette. But she wasn't alone. Standing beside her, her back to him, was the silhouette of a woman, a silhouette that, even from afar, made his stomach drop. It was her. It had to be. The way she tilted her head to listen to Leah, the elegant yet restrained posture, the cascade of brown hair the gentle wind lifted, it all screamed Helena. He walked toward them, each step a battle against the urge to either run or flee. The gravel under his shoes seemed to cry out, announcing his approach. Leah saw him first, and a relieved smile lit up her face. She waved, taking the woman's hand and pulling her gently. He came. I told you he would. The woman turned, and Richard's world shattered into a million pieces. The resemblance was so overwhelming, so painfully precise, that it stole his breath. It was Helena's face, but aged by time and worry, etched with a maturity he didn't know, the same almond-shaped eyes, the same mouth he had dreamed of kissing 1,000 times. But there was something different, an invisible barrier, a veil of strangeness that made her simultaneously the person he knew best in the world and a complete stranger. The shock was physical, a blow to the chest that made him stagger. For a moment, the park spun, the colors blurring into a meaningless smear. He reached out, steadying himself against the trunk of a tree. "Helena!" His voice came out as a rasp, a fragile sound that didn't seem his own. The woman watched him, her face a mask of studied calm, but he could see the panic flickering deep in her eyes. She took a step forward, Leah holding tightly to her hand like a small anchor in a storm. "Hello, Richard," she said, her voice sounding just as he remembered, but with a tone that chilled him. It was the voice of a polite stranger. "Leah has told me so much about you. I appreciate everything you've done for her." She spoke as if they were being introduced for the first time, as if the hundreds of memories they shared didn't exist. Richard's initial shock began to curdle into a wave of confusion and anger. What was this? Another game? Was she going to pretend she didn't know him? He felt the ground disappear from under him, reality twisting in a cruel way. The little girl, Leah, looked from one to the other, an enigmatic, childlike smile on her lips, as if she were the only one who understood the true nature of this impossible meeting. "You must have me confused with someone else," the woman continued, before he could form a coherent sentence. Her denial was like a slap. "My name is Laura Mendez." She held out her free hand, a formal, distancing gesture. Richard stood frozen, staring at her hand, and then at her face. It was a lie so blatant, so absurd, that he didn't know how to react. He could see the truth in her eyes, the Helena he loved hiding behind the facade of Laura. A helpless fury began to build inside him. After all these years, after all the suffering, she found him only to erase their past with a single sentence. At that moment, he didn't know what was worse, the 18 years of silence or the lie she was telling now. Looking straight into his eyes, Laura's outstretched hand hung in the air between them, an impassable chasm. Richard ignored it. His eyes were locked on hers, a silent battle of wills. "No," he said, his voice low and charged, with an intensity that made Leah flinch slightly. "I'm not mistaken. I could go 1,000 years without seeing you and I'd still recognize your eyes anywhere, Helena." The name came out as both an accusation and a plea. He wanted her to break, to admit the charade, to give him at least the dignity of the truth. But the woman, Laura, Helena, whoever she was, maintained her composure. She slowly withdrew her hand, her face shuttering, becoming an impenetrable fortress. "I'm sorry, sir. You must have known someone very special with that name, but that's not me." The coldness in her voice was a sharp blade, severing the last thread of hope he had been clinging to. The discomfort of the situation was almost unbearable. "Leah, sensing the emotional storm brewing between the two adults, tried to intervene. "Aunt Laura, this is Uncle Richard. He's really nice. He brings me sandwiches and reads me stories." The girl's innocence was a painful contrast to the complex drama unfolding. Laura forced a smile for the child, a tense spasm of her lips. "I know, sweetie, and I'm very grateful, but I think it's getting late. We should go." She tried to turn away, but Richard stepped forward, blocking her path. He couldn't let her go, not again, not like this. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "If you're not Helena, then why do you know about the blackberry pie? Why do you know about the sunflowers? Why does a little girl on the street know the code name of my most secret project?" Each question was a shot in the dark, but he saw a flicker of panic in her eyes before she masked it. "Leah is a very observant girl," she replied, her voice a little less steady. "She hears things. Kids are like that. As for the other things, they must be unhappy coincidences. I'm sorry if I've caused you any pain." The excuse was so weak, so transparent. It was almost an insult. Richard's anger began to give way to a deep, weary ache. He no longer had the strength to fight this wall of denial. He felt like a fool, chasing a ghost that, even in the flesh, refused to be real. He looked at Leah, who was now clinging to Laura's leg. Sensing the woman's fear and confusion, he realized his insistence was scaring them both. With a sigh of defeat, he stepped aside, clearing the path. "Fine," he said, his tone resigned. "Be whoever you want to be." He knelt to Leah's level, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll see you tomorrow, kiddo." Leah looked up at Laura, seeking permission. Laura hesitated for a moment, a silent war waging on her face. Finally, she gave a minimal nod. "Okay, but we really have to go now." She pulled Leah by the hand and walked away quickly, without looking back. Richard stood frozen, watching the two figures recede until they were just silhouettes against the dying light of the afternoon. He felt hollowed out, as if he'd run an emotional marathon and lost. Her denial was more painful than her absence. Her absence had allowed him to idealize, to dream. Her denial forced him to face a cruel reality. The woman he loved, or someone who was her exact copy, wanted nothing to do with him. He remained there for a long time, until the park began to empty and the lampposts flickered on, casting long, lonely shadows on the ground. He had to understand. Her motive was the key to everything. Fear, shame. There was something more, something he couldn't see. As he walked back to his car, his phone rang. It was Mark. "Rudy," said the gruff voice on the other end. "We found something. I don't know if it means anything, but there's a nurse at the public hospital downtown named Laura Mendez. She fits the age range and started working there about 5 years ago. But that's not the interesting part. According to hospital records, she has one regular visitor, an 8-year-old girl she's unofficially treating for a chronic medical condition. The girl's name is Leah." The information landed like a bomb. Suddenly, the dynamic shifted. The special friend wasn't just a protector. She was the caregiver of a sick child, and that child was the bridge between them. The game had just become much more serious. Mark's revelation reconfigured the entire chessboard in Richard's mind. This was no longer just a personal, painful mystery. There was a sick child at the center of it all. Helena's, or Laura's, refusal to acknowledge him took on a new layer of complexity. She wasn't just protecting herself, she was protecting Leah. The selflessness he had always loved in her was still there, fierce and unwavering, even if it was now aimed at him like a weapon of detachment. During the 4th week, he changed his approach drastically. No more confrontations, no more questions about the past. He would play her game, become Uncle Richard to the protégé of Laura, the nurse. He would use the one connection she couldn't deny, Leah's well-being, to stay close. He began bringing not just snacks, but also fresh fruit, vitamins, and even warmer clothes for the girl. all under the guise of simple generosity. Laura, who now accompanied Leah to every meeting, watched him with cautious suspicion. Her looks were a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. She spoke little, responding to Richard's attempts at conversation with polite monosyllables, always maintaining a safe distance. But he saw the cracks in her armor. He saw the relief in her eyes when Leah ate an apple with gusto, saw the tension in her shoulders relax slightly when he made the girl laugh. They formed a silent truce, a fractured, makeshift family bound by their love for this child. For Richard, each meeting was a bittersweet torture. Being so close to her and yet so far was a constant reminder of what he had lost. He studied her every gesture, every inflection in her voice, searching for the Helena he knew beneath Laura's surface. And sometimes he found her, in the way she brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, in the small smile that escaped when Leah said something funny. On one particularly cold afternoon, Richard found them sitting on a more secluded bench. Leah was pale and quiet, wrapped in a blanket he had brought the day before. Laura was checking the girl's temperature with a hand on her forehead, her face creased with worry. "She's not well today," Laura said, her voice low, momentarily forgetting her distant facade. "The fever is back." Richard's concern was instant and genuine. "What does she have? What can I do to help?" Laura hesitated, suspicion battling with need. "It's a chronic condition, a rare immune deficiency. She needs constant medication to stay stable." The confession hung in the air, a moment of vulnerability that broke the silence between them. "I can get the medicine, but sometimes it's not enough." In that instant, the barrier between them seemed to melt. He was no longer the haunting ex-boyfriend. He was an ally in the battle for Leah's health. He sat down next to them, his shoulder almost touching hers. "Let me help, for real. I can get her to a specialist, cover the treatment, anything." She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. For a second, he thought she would break, that the truth would finally come out. But she shook her head. "I can't. It's complicated." Before he could press her, Leah began to cough, a dry, racking cough that shook her small frame. The girl bent over, her face contorted in pain, and suddenly, her eyes rolled back and her body went limp, collapsing into Laura's arms. Panic took over. Laura screamed her name, shaking her gently, but Leah was unresponsive. Her already pale skin took on a bluish tint around her lips. "She's not breathing right," Laura cried, terror stripping her of all composure. "Richard, help me!" Without a second thought, Richard scooped the girl into his arms. She was terrifyingly light. "My car is close. We're going to the hospital, now." He ran through the park. Laura right behind him, tears streaming freely down her face. The world narrowed to that single moment, the fragile weight of Leah in his arms, the desperate sound of Laura's ragged breathing, and the primal fear of losing the most important thing in their lives. On the way to the hospital, as Laura tried to rouse the girl in the back seat, her phone slipped out of her purse. Richard, eyes glued to the road, saw the screen light up. On it, a photo. A photo of a younger Helena, smiling, holding a baby version of Leah. And beneath the photo, a contact name flashed insistently, Dad. The rhythmic, insistent beep of the heart monitor was the only sound breaking the tense silence of the hospital room. Leah lay in the bed, small and frail amidst the sterile white sheets, an IV line taped to her tiny hand. Richard and Laura sat in uncomfortable chairs on opposite sides of the room, a distance that seemed to represent the emotional chasm between them. The image from the phone screen, Dad, was seared into Richard's mind. Helena, Leah, and a father. The revelation hit him with the force of a gut punch, rewriting 18 years of his personal history with a single word. The pain of loss he had carried for so long was now mixed with a new, more bitter and complex feeling. Betrayal. She hadn't just left him. She had left him for someone else, had a child with another man. And that child was Leah. Leah's medical crisis had forced an alliance between them, but Richard's discovery had created a new, insurmountable barrier of silence. He couldn't look her in the eye. Every glimpse of her face, so painfully familiar, was now a reminder of his own naivete, of a love he thought was unique and had apparently been replaceable. Laura, for her part, seemed to have completely shut down. The terror of Leah's collapse had left her exhausted and vulnerable. She huddled in her chair, arms crossed over her chest, as if to shield herself from the world, or perhaps from him. She knew he'd seen the phone. He could feel the weight of the unspoken secret between them, thick and suffocating. A doctor entered the room, breaking the tension. He was an older man with tired but kind eyes. "Laura," he said, with a familiarity that indicated they knew each other well. "Her fever's broken. We've stabilized the crisis for now, but the tests show her condition is worsening. The current medications are losing their effectiveness." He turned to Richard. "And you are?" "A friend," Richard answered, the words sounding hollow and false. Laura or Helena intervened. "Dr. Mendez, this is Richard. He helped us bring her in." The doctor extended a hand to Richard. "Any friend of Laura and Leah's is a friend of mine. She's one of the best nurses I've ever had, and an even more dedicated mother." Mother. The word echoed in the room, embedding itself in Richard's heart. So that was it. The special friend was her mother. The woman he loved was the mother of the child who had become the center of his world. The doctor continued, oblivious to the silent drama. "We need to consider more aggressive options. There's an experimental treatment at a research center in Switzerland. The preliminary results are promising, but the cost, it's astronomical." He quoted a figure that would make most people flinch. For Richard, it was a significant but manageable sum. Without hesitating, he said, "I'll pay for it." Laura and the doctor stared at him, shocked. "Richard, no," she began. "I didn't ask for anything." "You don't have to ask," he cut her off, his tone sharper than he intended. "This isn't for you. It's for her." He looked at the sleeping girl, an overwhelming sense of protectiveness washing over him. In that moment, it didn't matter who the father was. It didn't matter about the betrayal or the lies. The only thing that mattered was this child's life. Richard's unwavering offer changed the dynamic once more. He was no longer just the ghost from the past or the casual benefactor. He was Leah's only hope. It gave him a power he didn't want, but couldn't ignore. And it put Laura in an impossible position. To save her daughter, she would have to accept help from the man she had spent years avoiding, the man whose heart she had broken. After the doctor left, a heavy silence settled again. Richard finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning inside him. He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes fixed on Leah. Is he a good father to her? The question was a knife, and he knew it. He saw her flinch out of the corner of his eye. She took a long time to answer, her voice a fragile whisper. "She's never met him. He doesn't know she exists." Laura's confession. "He doesn't know she exists," hung in the sterile air of the hospital room, thick and laden with implications. Richard turned to face her, confusion overpowering his anger. "What do you mean he doesn't know? You had his child and never told him." The story he had built in his mind, that of a simple betrayal, began to crumble, revealing something far more complex and dark beneath. Helena's face, he could no longer think of her as Laura, was pale, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall, as if reliving a painful memory. "It's not that simple, Richard. You don't understand." "Then make me understand," he exploded, years of frustration boiling over. 18 years, Helena. 18 years of silence. And now you show up with a sick daughter and a web of lies. I deserve an explanation. The volume of his voice made Leah stir in her bed, murmuring in her sleep. The sound had an immediate effect on both of them. Richard's anger dissipated, replaced by guilt, and Helena seemed to shrink even further, her pleading eyes begging for silence. She stood up and gestured toward the door. "Not here, please." They stepped out into the silent hallway, lit by a fluorescent glow that made everything look pale and unreal. They stopped by a window overlooking the sleeping city, a panorama of distant lights that seemed indifferent to their drama. Helena finally faced him, and for the first time, Richard saw not a liar, but a terrified woman, carrying a burden he could barely imagine. "When I left," she began, her voice trembling, "it wasn't because I wanted to. It wasn't because of another man." She paused, gathering her courage. "My father, you remember him, how proud and controlling he was. He was involved in some very dangerous business, things I only found out about too late. He made enemies, powerful, ruthless people. One night, they came for him. There was a situation. We were forced to run, to disappear, to leave everything behind. They gave us new identities, a new place to live, with the promise that if we ever came back or contacted anyone from our past, not only would our lives be at risk, but yours would be too." The story was so dramatic, so far removed from the simple life they had shared, that Richard stared at her with skepticism. It sounded like a movie script. "And me?" he asked, his voice raw with pain. "Why didn't you tell me? I would have helped. I would have run away with you." A sad, bitter smile touched her lips. "You were a 17-year-old boy, Richard. What could you have done against men who don't think twice about erasing an entire family? Involving you would have been a death sentence. My father made me swear. Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I did it to protect you." The selflessness in her words, the idea that her disappearance had been an act of love, not abandonment, was a difficult pill to swallow. It challenged the victim narrative he had cultivated for nearly 2 decades. "And Leah?" he asked, his voice softer. "I found out I was pregnant a few weeks after we left. I was alone, with a new identity, in a strange city. I had to raise her in secret, always looking over my shoulder, always afraid they would find us." The story, as fantastic as it seemed, began to fill in the gaps, to explain the paranoia, the fear, the need to hide behind a fake name. She hadn't betrayed him. She had protected him. The weight of that realization crushed him. For all these years, he had hated her for abandoning him, when in fact she had sacrificed her own happiness for his safety. Guilt flooded him, an overwhelming wave of remorse for his behavior, for his accusations. He looked at her, truly saw her for the first time since they had reunited, not the ghost of his past, but a woman who had survived an unimaginable hell, a mother fighting desperately to save her child. He took a step toward her, the chasm between them finally beginning to close. He wanted to say he was sorry, that he understood, that he forgave her. But before the words could form, her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, and all the color drained from her face. The panic returned to her eyes, 10 times more intense. "They found me," she whispered, pure terror in her voice. "They're here. In the city." Helena's declaration, "They've found me," fell into the silent hospital corridor like a death sentence. The air grew heavy, charged with the palpable fear radiating from her. Richard, who seconds earlier had been about to offer comfort and forgiveness, was jolted back into a state of high alert. Their personal drama was eclipsed by a real and imminent threat. Who found you?" he asked, his voice low and urgent, instinctively positioning himself to shield her. "My father's family," she whispered, her eyes fixed on Leah's room door, as if expecting monsters to burst through at any moment. "Not his enemies, Richard. Worse, my uncles. After my father disappeared, they took over the business. They want me to come back. They want me to testify in a legal case to consolidate their power. They don't care about the danger, only the money." The complexity of the situation increased exponentially. It was no longer an anonymous danger from the past, but a familial threat. People who knew her, who knew how to pressure her. "Do they know about Leah?" Richard asked, the thought chilling him to the bone. Helena shook her head, tears finally streaming down her face. No, no one knows. She's my only weakness, my only secret. If they find out, they'll use her against me. They'll force me to do what they want, and then when I'm no longer useful, they'll discard us. The desperation in her voice was absolute. She was trapped, with her past catching up to her and her daughter's future on the line. Richard felt a surge of protective fury. He would not let anything happen to them, not after everything they had been through, not now that he had found them. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice firm, taking the control she had clearly lost. "We're getting you both out of here. I have resources, people. I can hide you somewhere safe until we figure out Leah's situation." The offer hung between them, a lifeline in a sea of despair. But Helena shook her head again. "We can't run, not with Leah in this state. She needs stability, constant medical care. Moving her now would be too dangerous." She was right. They were stuck. The hospital, which should have been a sanctuary of healing, had become a gilded cage. Leah's illness, which had brought them together, was now the anchor preventing them from escaping the approaching danger. The irony was cruel. In the days that followed, the tension in the hospital became almost unbearable. Richard mobilized his security team, placing discreet men at all hospital entrances, turning the pediatrics floor into a makeshift fortress. He spent most of his time there, dividing it between tense business calls and silent vigils by Leah's bedside. He and Helena barely spoke. The urgency of the situation prevented them from processing the avalanche of emotions the truth had unleashed. They operated as a team, focused on a single goal, Leah's safety and recovery. But in the quiet moments, the looks they exchanged said everything. There was regret, pain, and a fractured love that refused to die. While Leah's condition remained stable but precarious, the external pressure mounted. A man in an expensive suit, introducing himself as the family's lawyer, showed up at the hospital, demanding to speak with Laura Mendez. Richard's security turned him away, but the message was clear. They knew where she was. The threat was no longer a shadow. It had a face. Helena grew paler and more withdrawn. She barely ate, barely slept, the fear corroding her from the inside. Richard felt helpless. His fortune, his power, all seemed useless against this kind of enemy. He could buy the best treatment in the world for Leah, but he couldn't erase Helena's past. On one particularly long night, he found her crying silently in the hallway. He approached and, for the first time, placed a hand on her shoulder. The contact was electric, a recognition of years of distance. "We're going to get through this," he said, more to convince himself than her. "We'll find a way out." She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "There is no way out, Richard. The only thing they understand is power. And the only thing I have that they want is my testimony. To save my daughter, I might have to sacrifice myself." The idea horrified him. "Don't talk like that, ever." He pulled her into a clumsy embrace, the first in 18 years. She resisted for a moment, then collapsed against his chest, her sobs shaking her body. In that hug, amidst the antiseptic smell of the hospital, time seemed to rewind. They were no longer the billionaire and the fugitive nurse. They were just Richard and Helena, two scared teenagers, alone against the world. The hug in the hospital corridor was a turning point. It broke the final barrier of formality and fear that had separated them, forging an unbreakable alliance from the ashes of their past. In the days that followed, as Leah's health flickered like a candle flame in a draught, Richard and Helena began to work together, no longer as strangers united by circumstance, but as partners. Richard's investigation into Helena's past took a new direction. It was no longer about finding the truth behind her disappearance. It was about finding a weapon, a chink in her family's armor that could give them leverage. He dove in headfirst, using his vast resources to unearth secrets that had been buried for decades. Mark, his head of security, worked around the clock, combing through financial records, old contacts, and forgotten rumors. Meanwhile, Helena focused on the one thing she could control, Leah's health. She spent hours talking with doctors, researching the experimental treatment in Switzerland, and caring for her daughter with a fierce dedication that moved everyone on the hospital staff. Richard's constant presence by her side gave her a strength she hadn't felt in years. Knowing she was no longer alone in the fight allowed her to breathe, to think more clearly. During one of the long nightly vigils, while Leah slept a peaceful, medicated sleep, they finally had a chance to truly talk. Not about the threats or the illness, but about them. "I never stopped thinking about you," Richard admitted, his voice low in the quiet room. "All these years, every achievement felt empty because I had no one to share it with. No one was ever you." Helena looked at him, her eyes glistening in the faint light of the heart monitor. "I kept every memory of us like a treasure," she said. "In the worst moments, when I thought I couldn't go on, I would close my eyes and remember your smile, the sound of your laugh. I told our stories to Leah like they were fairy tales. She grew up knowing the boy who loved sunflowers. Even though he was allergic to them, the revelation hit him squarely. He wasn't a stranger to Leah. He was the hero of her mother's bedtime stories. It explained the familiarity, the strange questions. The girl, in her innocence, had been trying to connect the Uncle Richard from the park with the Richard from her mother's stories, not understanding they were the same person. The subplot about Richard's family also began to surface. In his investigation of Helena's past, Mark had stumbled upon an unexpected connection. Richard's father, a man he had always considered the epitome of integrity, had done business with Helena's father years ago. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, but the deeper they dug, the stranger the connection became. There were unexplained financial transactions, trips that didn't make sense. Richard refused to believe it, but the seed of doubt was planted. Was it possible his father knew something about Helena's disappearance, that he had hidden something from him all these years? The idea was so disturbing that he pushed it to the back of his mind, focusing on the immediate threat. The situation came to a head at the end of the 5th week. Helena's family lawyer returned, this time with a court order demanding an audience with her. The legal pressure was a new kind of attack, harder to repel. At the same time, the doctors reported that Leah's condition had deteriorated. The window of opportunity for the treatment in Switzerland was closing fast. They were running out of time and options. That night, the hopelessness was palpable. Richard was in his makeshift office at the hospital, staring at a wall of documents and connections that led nowhere, when Mark came in with a folder in his hand. "Sir, I think we've found something. It's a long shot, but it's the only thing we've got." He opened the folder on the desk. Inside was a copy of an old birth certificate. The mother's name was Helena. The child's name was Leah, but the space for the father's name was not blank. On it, written in a familiar, slightly trembling hand, was Richard's full name. The document on the desk seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Richard stared at it, the black letters on the yellowed paper dancing before his eyes. His name, there, undeniable, on the line designated for the father. The world tilted on its axis, sending a shockwave through his body that left him breathless. Leah, his daughter, the girl from the park, with her wise eyes and precocious dignity, was his daughter. The revelation was so monumental, so cataclysmic, that for a moment he couldn't think, only feel. A torrent of emotions hit him, the overwhelming joy of an unknown fatherhood, the sharp anger for a secret kept for so long, the excruciating pain of lost years, and above all, a love so fierce and protective it threatened to burst from his chest. Every moment with Leah was recontextualized in his mind. The instant connection in the park, his irrational desire to protect her, the warmth he felt when she called him uncle. It wasn't just empathy, it was the primal recognition of his own flesh and blood. "How?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Without taking his eyes off the paper, "Where did you get this?" "It was filed away in a small town clerk's office from the first city she fled to," Mark explained. "It seems she registered it right after the birth. But later, when she got her new identity, she created a new document, leaving the father's name blank to protect her. And you, this original was never destroyed." Helena had named him the father. In the midst of her flight, alone and terrified, she had given him that right, if only on paper, a silent testament to a love that had never died. The anger he had felt at her for hiding this from him dissolved, replaced by a deep, painful understanding. She hadn't hidden Leah from him. She had hidden Leah for him, to protect him from a dangerous world he never knew he was a part of. He picked up the document, the fragile paper feeling like it weighed a ton in his hands. He had to talk to her. Now, he strode down the hall, his heart hammering a furious rhythm against his ribs. He found her in the room, dozing in an armchair beside Leah's bed, exhaustion etched on every line of her face. He stopped at the door, watching them, mother and daughter, his daughter. The sight filled him with a tenderness so intense it ached. He entered quietly and touched her shoulder. She woke with a start, her eyes wide with fear, which softened when she saw him. "Richard, is something wrong with Leah?" "No, she's fine," he reassured her, his voice thick with emotion. He held the paper out to her. I just need to know why." Helena looked at the birth certificate, and her face crumbled. The tears she had held back for so long finally came, silent and unending. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, her head in her hands. "I wanted to tell you, so many times I wanted to, but I was so scared. If they knew she was your daughter, they would have a weapon not just against me, but against you too. You would become a target. I couldn't risk it. I couldn't lose you both." She looked up at him, her soul bare in its vulnerability. "Do you believe me?" He knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "I believe you," he said, and he had never meant anything more in his life. "But it's over now, Helena. No more running, no more hiding. She is my daughter, and I will fight for our family with everything I have." In that moment, something shifted in Richard. The calculating businessman gave way to the father and the protector. Hesitation and fear were replaced by a steely resolve. He knew what he had to do. The next day, he called a meeting with Helena's family lawyer. The man walked into the hospital conference room with an air of victorious arrogance, expecting to find a broken woman. Instead, he found Richard, sitting at the head of the table with a glacial calm that was far more intimidating than any outburst of anger. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Richard began, his voice soft but cutting. "Miss Mendez will not be going anywhere. And if you or your clients come near her or my daughter again, I will bring the full weight of my empire down to crush you. And believe me, your family's financial secrets would not survive a tenth of the scrutiny I can provide." The clear, direct threat made the lawyer falter, but then a smug grin spread across his lips. "Your daughter," he sneered. "What proof do you have? Words mean nothing in our world." Richard leaned forward, his eyes locking with the man's. He slid the original birth certificate across the polished table. The lawyer glanced at the document, and the color drained from his face. He clearly hadn't been expecting that, but his surprise was short-lived. He composed himself, a new, dangerous, and calculating glint in his eye. "This changes things," he said slowly. "It changes everything. An heiress no one knew about. That makes her far more valuable to us, and far more vulnerable." The door to the room suddenly opened. Two large, menacing-looking men stepped inside, positioning themselves behind the lawyer's chair. The trap had been sprung. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to take Helena, and now that they knew about Leah, the threat was 1,000 times worse. The air in the conference room grew thin, heavy with implied menace. The two men who entered were the embodiment of brute force, a stark contrast to the lawyer's legalistic facade. The man's smug smile was that of someone who had just turned the tables in his favor. He believed he had Richard cornered, thinking the revelation of paternity was the final weapon he needed. But he had underestimated the depth of Richard's transformation. The fear the lawyer expected to see wasn't there. In its place was a cold fury, a terrifying calm. Richard didn't flinch. He simply picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Mark, you can come in." The door opened again, but this time it wasn't two men who entered, but four, all dressed in discreet suits that couldn't hide the posture of highly trained security professionals, Richard's team. They positioned themselves silently, flanking the lawyer's men, a quiet and overwhelming show of power. The arrogance on the lawyer's face faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "What is this?" he stammered. "I don't respond to threats, and sir," Richard said, rising slowly, his presence dominating the room. "I neutralize them. You and your men will leave this hospital now, and you will relay a message to your bosses. The hunt is over. Helena and Leah are under my protection. Any attempt at contact, any shadow that comes near them, will be considered a direct act of aggression against me. And I am a far more dangerous enemy than Helena's father ever was." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Oh, and one more thing. Mark, show him." Mark handed a tablet to the lawyer. On the screen was a series of documents, offshore bank statements, records of properties in tax havens, the irrefutable proof of the financial misconduct Helena's family was trying to cover up with her testimony. "I don't need her testimony," Richard continued. "I have everything right here. If she is forced to testify, this entire file will be sent to every regulatory agency and media outlet in the country. You wanted to consolidate power. I can destroy what little you have left with the push of a button. The choice is yours." The lawyer looked from the screen to Richard's impassive face, sweat beading on his forehead. The hunter had become the hunted. He gave a stiff nod, gathered his men, and left the room without another word. The danger that had haunted Helena for 18 years had been dismantled in less than 10 minutes. With the external threat neutralized, the most important challenge remained: saving Leah. Richard didn't waste a second. He mobilized his fortune and influence, contacting the research center in Switzerland. He not only funded the treatment, but chartered a state-of-the-art air ambulance, equipped with a full medical team to ensure Leah's transfer was as safe as possible. Helena, free from the fear that had paralyzed her for so long, could finally focus entirely on her daughter's recovery. The gratitude in her eyes, every time she looked at Richard, was something he would cherish forever. They became a unit, making decisions together, sharing hopes and fears. Before they left, Richard needed to resolve one last thing. He went to visit his father, taking the evidence of the business connection Mark had discovered. His father, an old and frail man, listened in silence. When Richard was done, the old man sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of decades. "And I knew," he said, his voice weak. "Helena's father came to me the night they fled. He told me everything, begged me not to tell you anything, to keep you safe. Keeping that secret was the greatest burden of my life. I watched you suffer all these years and couldn't do anything. Can you forgive me?" The revelation was shocking, but somehow liberating. There had been no malice, only a misguided paternal love. Richard looked at his father and saw not a traitor, but a man who, like Helena, had made a terrible sacrifice to protect him. "There's nothing to forgive," Richard said, and embraced him, healing a wound he never knew he had. The journey to Switzerland was tense but filled with hope. They never left Leah's side. At the research center, the girl was received by a team of specialists. The treatment began immediately. The days turned into weeks of agonizing waiting. Richard and Helena leaned on each other, rediscovering the love that had been frozen in time. They talked for hours, filling in the gaps of 18 years, healing the wounds of the past with truth and forgiveness. And then, on a sunny morning, the head doctor walked into their room with a smile. "It's working," he said. "Her response to the treatment is remarkable. She's going to be okay. It will take time, but she will have a long and healthy life." In that moment, all the battles, all the pain, all the suffering had been worth it. They held each other, crying tears of relief and joy. They looked through the window to Leah's bed, where she slept peacefully, and they knew that their future together had finally begun. 6 weeks. It felt like a lifetime. 6 weeks since that first chance meeting in the park. A meeting Richard now understood was anything but chance. It had been fate, or perhaps the inexplicable instinct of a child, weaving the broken threads of 3 lives into a new and vibrant tapestry. The autumn that had begun melancholic and grey now gave way to a brilliant sun that flooded the Swiss hospital room, a reflection of the light that had returned to their hearts. Leah's recovery was, as the doctors had said, remarkable. With each passing day, a little more color returned to her cheeks, a little more sparkle returned to her eyes. The girl who had survived on the streets with a quiet dignity now blossomed under the constant care and unconditional love of her parents. One afternoon, as Richard was reading one of her favorite stories, Leah interrupted him. "Dad," she said, testing the word for the first time. The simplicity of that sound, the naturalness with which she spoke it, was the most beautiful thing Richard had ever heard. His eyes filled with tears. He leaned over and kissed her forehead. "Yes, sweetie, I'm your dad." Helena, watching from the doorway, smiled, tears streaming freely down her face. There were no more secrets, no more fear, just a family finally whole. During the recovery period, they made plans. Richard decided to start a foundation dedicated to providing cutting-edge medical care for underprivileged children, naming it the Sunflower Foundation, in honor of the flowers Helena loved, for always seeking the light. Helena, in turn, planned to use her nursing experience to oversee the foundation's projects, ensuring the help reached those who needed it most. When Leah was finally discharged, they didn't return to the life they had before. Richard sold his impersonal city penthouse and bought a house in the countryside with a large garden and a swing hanging from a sturdy tree. It was a place to put down roots, to build new memories. One day, as they were unpacking boxes, Helena approached Richard, holding something in her hands. It was a small, worn journal. "I wrote this in the early years," she said, "so that one day Leah would know the truth about her father, about how much I loved him." Richard took it, his hands trembling. He didn't need to read it to know what it said. He could see it in her eyes. Their love hadn't been lost. It had just been kept safe, waiting for the right moment to bloom again. The emotional climax of their journey was not a grand event, but a simple, quiet moment. On a sunny afternoon, the 3 of them were in the garden. Leah, now running and laughing, chased butterflies, her energy a testament to her healing. Richard and Helena watched her from a bench, holding hands. "She knew, didn't she?" Richard asked, his voice low. "Somehow, deep down, I think she knew we were meant to be together." Helena squeezed his hand. "She never lost hope. She brought us together. She was our little architect of happiness." Just then, Leah ran up to them, holding a dandelion puff. "Make a wish," she said, with all the seriousness of a child. Richard and Helena looked at each other. They didn't need a wish. Everything they could ever want was right there in front of them. They blew the seeds together, watching them dance on the wind, tiny parachutes of hope scattering into the world. Their story was a testament that true love, like a sunflower, always seeks the light, no matter how long and dark the night. Richard hadn't just regained his first love, he had found a greater purpose, a family that healed the scars on his soul. Helena hadn't just survived. She had found the peace and security that had been stolen from her. And Leah, the little girl from the park who had only wanted a piece of bread, ended up giving them the bread of life, a second chance at happiness. And so, 6 weeks after an unlikely meeting, 3 lives were completely transformed, not by money or power, but by the courage of a child who believed that love could, indeed, heal all wounds.